Late June sunlight stretched across the southern lawn of Chateau Montfleur, a gray stone castle nestled midway up a hillside in the Loire region. Sunbeams streamed through stained glass, casting streaks of amber and gold along the hallway where Elena Marceau, the head butler's daughter, stooped to retrieve the last napkin that had fallen from her silver tray. No one at Count Sebastian Whitford's birthday party noticed her, and Elena was used to that. She had lived her whole life in the service quarters, knew every crack in the walls, every creak of the library door hinge, yet no one could remember her name when calling for things. That was her advantage. People didn't hide their secrets from someone invisible. Today, the secret began with a clock ticking off key. As Elena gathered crystal glasses to return to the kitchen, she heard tick, tick, click. It wasn't the deep, familiar chime of the grand pendulum clock in the main hall. This sound was dry and mechanical, like a metal lock clicking out of place. It came from behind the paneled wall across from the Count's study. Elena stopped mid-step. Standing alone in the corridor, she counted. 1, 2, click. Again. That wall bore a portrait of a Whitford ancestor. She'd seen the restorers clean it once and knew there was a hollow brick space behind. But the hall clock was several meters away. This sound was too close. She pressed her ear to the wood. Laughter from the reception still echoed faintly. The string quartet had moved on to another waltz. No one noticed her, and no one else heard that tiny click. Elena traced her fingers along the painting's frame. The bricks behind weren't warm like outer walls, indicating a void. In the lower left corner, she spotted a faint crack, the cement newer than its surroundings. Someone had tampered with it, then sealed it back. Her heart quickened. Years of working at Montfleur had taught her one thing. Everything was documented unless the master of the house wanted it forgotten. Elena took a step back. She told herself, don't risk it if you don't understand it. But the slow click, like a countdown, urged her on. She set the tray down on the carpet, straightened her apron, and took out the small silver tweezer she used to handle polishing cotton. Useless for a cook, but for Elena it fit perfectly into the cement crack. She hadn't even begun to pry when Mademoiselle Marceau? A deep voice, roughened slightly by wine. Elena turned. Count Sebastian stood at the far end of the corridor, holding a cognac glass. The late afternoon light cast a copper hue on his hair. He rarely left the hall while guests were still present. Elena bowed quickly. Sir, I was picking up the napkin. Whitford nodded slightly, his eyes seeming not to focus on her but to glance over her shoulder, scanning the wall behind. Just for a second. Then he turned and walked away, the sound of his leather shoes fading. In that brief moment, Elena realized the Count had heard something too, but he chose to ignore it. She did not. When the third click echoed through the hall, Elena made her decision. It was time for someone invisible to look straight at what no one else dared to see. She slipped the tweezer into the cement seam, the panel shifted, revealing a narrow, dark gap behind. Not a polished secret corridor from a comic book, just a tight utility recess barely large enough to house an electronic safe. Its LED display read 004. Each click was a second ticking down from a 4-minute countdown. Elena swallowed hard. Someone had opened the safe less than 5 minutes ago. What was inside and would disappear once the timer hit 0. Downstairs, the waltz reached its climax. Voices rose in song. Fireworks were about to be launched for the Count's birthday. 4 minutes wasn't long, but long enough for a secret to change hands. Elena closed the gap, covering the fresh crack. She picked up her tray and hurried back to the kitchen. Just before the swing door shut behind her, she glanced once more at the wall. The fourth click was swallowed by the boom of fireworks echoing through the valley. In the kitchen, the wall clock read 6:02 p.m., time for cake cutting, also the moment Elena began recording her first secret in the small notebook hidden in her apron. 1800 hours, mechanical sound behind South Corridor. Safe? 4-minute countdown. Only person present, Count SW. She dotted the ink, took a deep breath. The counterfeit cash case in Lyon 2 years ago had started with a single offbeat lock. Maybe history was about to repeat itself. Only this time, Elena Marceau would not be standing on the sidelines. Count Sebastian Whitford stood motionless in the south corridor of Chateau Montfleur, his right hand cradling an untouched glass of cognac, his left thumb absently stroking the edge of his velvet lapel. Late-day sunlight spilled through the stained glass panes, scattering mottled colors across the oak wall that held his ancestors' portrait. Bearded men in military dress coats, staring down at the last Whitford heir still living in this very house. A sharp click broke the hush. It was no creaking timber or hissing pipe, but metal in deliberate motion, a mechanical sound with intent. And, just as on 2 other occasions this week, it came from the wall behind that portrait, the very spot where, minutes earlier, he had watched the young maid Elena Marceau pawing about in a way that had nothing to do with retrieving fallen napkins as she'd claimed. Montfleur's silence was luxurious yet loaded. The chateau never spoke unless compelled. Each tiny click was a hairline crack running through the polished veneer. Sebastian had told no one, neither Isabelle, his wife, nor the security engineer. A part of him, the part that once knew every corner of this castle, refused to admit he was no longer in control. The cognac remained warm in his hand, though he felt nothing. He looked again at the painting. Behind it, he knew well, lay an obsolete service shaft, bricked up since the 1960s. Yet something had changed, not time's erosion, but someone's hand erasing every trace. He exhaled slowly. Elena, daughter of the former housekeeper, had floated about his home like a shadow since childhood. As an adult she was silent, polite, flawlessly dutiful. But today, when he caught her gaze by the wall, there had been something else. Not fear, not guilt, awareness, as though she knew exactly what stood before her. He took a sip, then turned toward his study, though his mind stayed with that click, beating inside his chest rather than in the wall. In the reception hall, strings still mingled with the laughter of guests from Marseille, Lyon, Paris. Isabelle, the woman named for perfection, glided among them, smiling just enough, tilting her head at the perfect angle. She wore a cream-white sheath dress. Sebastian's mother's pearls brushed her collarbone with each gracious nod. To the guests she was the soul of the party. To Sebastian she was a contract long past term, one he no longer knew how to annul. At the far end of the buffet, Elena stood quietly, decanting wine into crystal goblets on a silver tray. From there she caught every clipped sentence, every lowered voice discussing new investments. She dared not turn, yet she felt Isabelle's glance, brief, unmalicious, merely the way one checks a wine's temperature before pouring. Elena looked away at the right second, working on, but in her mind she etched another note she noticed. No attempt to hide it. That night, with the chateau sunk in stillness, Sebastian sat alone in the old study. Little had changed since his Father's Day. He slid open the bottom drawer of a bookcase. Isabelle never looked there, and drew out the original Montfleur legacy file. Figures, clauses, familiar legalese. He compared it with the updated version Isabelle had presented a week ago. Differences, stark ones. A land preservation clause gone. Signing authority transferred entirely to the woman he once thought would sooner die than betray him. As he reached the final page, his eyes fell on something that didn't belong, a small cloth-bound notebook dusty with kitchen soot. He opened it. On the first page, in neat script, 1800 hours, mechanical sound behind South Corridor. Safe. Countdown. Signed, E.M. Elena Marceau. She had heard, seen, and recorded it. For the first time in years, Sebastian felt relegated to the sidelines of his own life. Chateau, fortune, even the walls that symbolized power, all moved without him. Yet a maid, the housekeeper's child, saw what he did not and chose silence. Not from fear, perhaps because he would never have believed her. He stared at the page. She had stepped into the dark, and he, master of the light, sat unsure what to do. Just then the click sounded again from the corridor. He did not rise, but he understood. Montfleur's doors had never opened for the timid. If Elena Marceau dared push her hand into a crack in the wall, perhaps he must learn to listen, truly listen, for the first time in his life. Across the chateau, in the kitchen, Elena dried her hands on a cloth, eyes on a moonlit tile. She did not know that in the study a man was, for the first time, reading her name as a clue. 2 people, one wielding rusted power, the other razor-sharp silence, had touched the truth. From today on, the walls would not answer. They would keep their counsel until someone bold enough broke them open. Elena Marceau, attic room. Moonlight angled through the dormer window, spilling over the low wooden desk. Each black ink line she wrote was steady, slanted, reflecting her state. No fear, no panic, only absolute focus. She'd heard the 4th click of the day, this time 2 floors above the South Corridor. It could not be imagined. She breathed slowly. In her hands lay a scaled plan of the chateau's south wing, secretly photographed from the butler's archives while she dusted the boxes outside. She had noticed an old conduit behind the paneled wall, a wartime service pipe leading to the underground bomb shelter. If the pipe still existed, and if someone had restored it, then behind the portrait stood not merely a safe but an entrance to something larger. Again she wrote. 4th sound. Location, ground floor, audible from 3rd. Conclusion, mechanism spans more than one area. She folded the notebook, hid it beneath a loose floorboard where her mother had once stashed wages, donned an old sweater, and slipped into the hallway without a creak. Nighttime. Montfleur breathed differently. The day's splendor gave way to sighing walls, creaking floors, humming pipes. Elena knew these sounds since childhood, but tonight's click had purpose and pattern. She headed to the library, whose side door reached the south corridor without crossing the salons. In her pocket, a tiny candle, a hand mirror, and a dark lipstick, cosmetics to some, tools to her. Inside the storage nook beside the library, she squeezed through the utility gap. First time, only wall. Second time, using mirror and candlelight, she spotted a movable panel behind the safe, no hinge, no lock, a dull brass pin in the lower corner. Hard to see unless you knew. She dabbed lipstick on a fingertip, touched the pin, withdrew, color on metal. She pressed, latch, the very click she'd heard. The wall eased inward. Air cold enough to raise goose flesh met her. Not a tidy secret corridor, but a patched-up relic. Rough stone, barely 60 centimeters wide. She stepped in. The passage ended at an oak door with a wrought iron handle. No voices, only a faint electric hum. She tested the latch, unlocked. Inside, a windowless cell scarcely 2 meters square, a steel table, a computer monitor, and chilling her, the numbered document boxes typical of a notary's archives. One file, Succession Whitford, non-public annex. Inside, transfers of land to an anonymous Luxembourg fund, each bearing a scanned Sebastian signature unlike any in the official library. She understood at once. Isabel was quietly stripping the Whitford estate, leaving no retreat. She photographed everything, hands steady as steel. Then, something an observer would not do but a participant must, she swapped 2 folders, enough that Isabel would know someone had been here. Panel closed, lipstick pin wiped, paper marker replaced. Elena exited the storeroom as if fetching tablecloths. The sun set high, lunch would soon begin. From a second-floor window, Sebastian watched the young woman cross the flagstone court. He neither called nor questioned her. But his gaze settled on the faint red smear at her cuff, the lipstick used to mark a lock. He no longer needed proof. Now he believed. Lunch that day was held on the West Terrace, where lavender had just come into bloom and the wind from the valley made the linen tablecloths shimmer under the sunlight. The guests were 3. A financier from Bordeaux, a female director of a conservation fund, and a salt and pepper-haired man who introduced himself as a lawyer specializing in European heritage structures. Isabel Whitford sat at the head of the table, radiant, as if she had not wandered the chateau's corridors in the dead of night. Every word she spoke was gentle, every smile calculated. To most, she sounded charming. Only those who had heard her on tape would recognize the thin blade of sarcasm hidden within every syllable. Sebastian arrived late. He offered no apology, no excuse, just pulled out a chair and sat down, nodding to the guests like a statue being returned to its rightful place. Elena stood near the side table, her eyes quietly tracking every subtle movement. The man's hand on his glass, the glance exchanged between Isabel and the lawyer, the brief furrow on Sebastian's face when the menu was set before him. The main course was wine-braised veal ribs, Isabel's choice, though she knew her husband had disliked it since his youth. A subtle reminder. Even the tastes at this table were hers to dictate. The meal passed in the artificial rhythm of the upper class, conversations about long-term visions, strategic opportunities, and conditional preservation. But Elena didn't listen with her ears. She listened through the silences between lines, through the places where speech moved too quickly, through the way Sebastian placed his knife and fork down too gently, as if afraid to scratch the surface of something already beginning to crack. Then, during dessert, Isabel spoke, looking only at Sebastian. "You still haven't signed the official transfer documents." Her voice was soft. The sentence sounded like a reminder. But no one at the table understood better than Elena. It was a command. Sebastian placed his espresso cup down, his fingers slowly turning the handle. He didn't answer immediately. He didn't look at his wife. He simply asked, in a low, clear voice, "Which transfer?" "You mean the contract you signed with yourself?" Silence. Not the kind born of awkwardness, but the kind that halts a stage play when the performance slips out of rhythm and the lead actor must pause to reclaim the audience. Isabel smiled, but Elena saw it clearly. Her lips were held just a moment too long to be natural. "You're joking," she said, then turned to the guests, her expression smoothing over. "My husband enjoys testing people's nerves." Sebastian looked at her for a moment, then turned to the lawyer across from him, the man who was trying hard to appear neutral, though sweat had already begun to stain the collar of his shirt. You say you specialize in heritage structures. So, if a contract is submitted with a forged signature, based on invalid power of attorney, does it still hold legal value? The lawyer flushed. Well, no, if proven falsified. Thank you, Sebastian interrupted. Just curious. Isabel set down her spoon. She stood graceful, unhurried, but her eyes flashed like a blade pulled from its sheath. She said nothing, offered no reaction. She simply turned away, her silk dress swirling like a small storm as she left the table. Elena watched her go. Then she stepped forward to pour more water for Sebastian. Slowly, unnecessarily. As she leaned in, he spoke very quietly, just enough for one person to hear. You've seen that room, haven't you? Elena didn't look up. She didn't nod. She simply placed the carafe down, wiped the rim of his glass with a clean cloth and stepped back. No confirmation, no denial, just a silence, the kind held by someone who possesses the evidence, but hasn't yet brought it forward. Someone who stands in the shadows and knows that the person across from them has finally begun to see. The luncheon ended with polite pretense. The guests were escorted to their cars. Isabel did not return. Sebastian went to his study. Elena walked toward the library. No one stopped her. In front of the entrance to the technical shaft, she paused. A piece of white paper had been neatly torn and left just under the door gap. One sentence, handwritten in violet ink, the penmanship sharp, feminine, but cold as steel. Don't think I don't know who's digging. Those who live in the dark often forget they leave footprints. No signature. None was needed. Elena picked up the note, crumpled it, and tucked it into her coat pocket. She wasn't afraid, but she understood one thing clearly. Isabel was responding. And from now on, every step would have to be measured in seconds. That night, Montfleur did not sleep. In the attic, Elena sat at her wooden desk, her hands empty, but her eyes writing into the invisible space before her. What she knew now had long surpassed the pages of her notebooks. A hidden room with forged documents, a forgotten tunnel, an undated deed, and a powerful woman who had moved from concealment to threat. The handwritten note from Isabel still lay on the table. The violet ink hadn't faded, as if it were waiting for Elena to respond. But she wasn't rushing. The small recorder she had hidden under the banquet table days earlier was now fully charged. Tomorrow, an unexpected meeting would take place with Isabel's financial advisor, Marceau Duret, a man infamous for his discretion and notorious in the world of asset transfers. The fact that he had suddenly arrived at the chateau under the label of internal audit was enough for Elena to know. Isabel was preparing her final move. Transfer, withdraw, disappear. She knew this game, but for the first time she wasn't playing alone. Downstairs in the library, Sebastian Whitford was rereading every line of the old contract copies. The paper had yellowed slightly, the print still crisp. But now, he saw what he had ignored for the past 3 years. The small line beneath the signature. Represent par Isabel Whitford mandataire exclusive. One word, exclusive, was all it took to strip everything from his hands. He turned the next page, an investment account statement in his name with control granted to a trust fund in Liechtenstein. At the bottom, the seal of a law firm in Nice, the same place where Isabel had spent 3 consecutive weeks of holiday last summer. He set the papers down and brought a hand to his forehead. Not because he'd been deceived, but because he had allowed himself to want to be deceived. He had grown far too comfortable letting others help manage his life. Elena had seen the truth before he did, and he would not let her fight alone. The next morning dawned under heavy clouds. Marceau Duret arrived at Montfleur in a dark vehicle with no commercial plates. The silver-haired man, pale-skinned, in an expensive trench coat, entered the house as though it already belonged to him. Elena, standing in the dining room preparing breakfast, observed him with alert, steady eyes. Duret didn't look at her. Like so many before him, he treated her as a shadow, a server, a background detail unworthy of caution. But today that was her advantage. The audit began in Isabel's office. The door was closed. No one was allowed in. Elena didn't need to be. She had already placed a small recording device beneath the tea table, where the silver pot and Limoges cups were always set during private meetings. As she returned to the kitchen, the device transmitted audio via Bluetooth to a phone hidden in her apron drawer. Isabel's voice was crisp, smooth as silk, calculating. I want everything pulled before the weekend. The new fund is ready. You just need to prepare the transfer documents. If Sebastian finds out, I'll handle it. He's gotten so slow I feel like I'm conning a statue. Laughter. Duret responded with a grunt. And the girl? The little maid. Has she heard anything? Isabel chuckled softly. If she has, she's smart enough to stay silent. Those downstairs always understand the rules of those above. Elena closed her eyes for a few seconds. Not from fear, but because she no longer had to guess. She now had what liars never anticipate: their own confession. That evening, in the formal salon once used by Sebastian's father, now reserved for receiving honored guests, he invited Elena to sit. For the first time, not in the kitchen, not in a place for staff. Before him sat a glass of wine, untouched. In front of Elena lay a folder containing the printed transcript of that morning's recording. She said nothing as she placed it down. Sebastian studied her for a long moment. You could turn this into a scandal. Elena shook her head. Scandals are fast, but truth takes longer. I don't want her vanishing in some headline about a noble wife embezzling assets. I want you to see and choose. Sebastian leaned back in his chair. You think I still have the strength to choose? Not because you still have strength, but because if you don't, no one will call this place Montfleur again. What passed between them was neither alliance nor servitude. It was a silence newly divided, each holding half. Sebastian picked up the folder but didn't open it. He only asked, "Will you stay?" Elena looked around the room where his father once met ambassadors, where her mother once polished every single glass. She nodded, until it's back in the right hands. Outside, in the hallway, the grandfather clock ticked, tick-tock, tick-tock. But it was no longer a warning. It was a wake-up call. It rained early the next morning. Heavy drops struck Montfleur's tiled roof like thousands of fingers drumming on the past. Elena stood by the window of the ground-floor laundry room, gently smoothing the edge of a napkin embroidered with the name Isabel W. The golden-white threads had frayed, yet the stitches remained sharp, so precise they felt almost artificial. Much like the woman who once owned it. In just a few hours, an unscheduled meeting would take place in the library. Called by Sebastian himself, handwritten invitations had been sent to Isabel, to Marceau Duret, to all concerned. Elena had quietly observed every step of the coming confrontation. There were no shouts, no threats. Only silent movements, folders brought up to the study, teacups no longer left untouched, and an old fountain pen taken out from the rosewood box Sebastian hadn't touched in years. A man who intends to truly sign his name, after all, chooses a true pen. She turned away from the window. The rain fell as though Montfleur was being washed clean or preparing to bury something final. Isabel entered the library at exactly 10 o'clock. Neither early nor late, as if this were a performance she had scripted herself. She wore a long coat of silvery gray, her hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, a single pearl in her left ear. She looked like she was attending a charity meeting, not facing the collapse of an empire she herself had engineered. Marceau Duret was already seated, flipping through a folder with visible boredom. Beside him sat Adrian, the Whitford family's longtime legal advisor, the only one who seemed genuinely uneasy. Sebastian said nothing as he entered. He simply opened the door, then closed it with his bare hand, not loudly but not gently either. Elena, standing just beyond the library, had not been invited. But she had already left everything needed: copies of documents, audio recordings, summaries of offshore transfers, all sealed in a thick envelope, wax-stamped and placed on the table. Not for show, but as a statement. This was evidence, not accusation. Sebastian took the tallest chair by the fireplace, not the chair for presiding over a meeting, but the one that had belonged to his father. A symbolic seat. He began with a simple sentence. "I can't sleep anymore." No one spoke. The rain still tapped against the tall window panes. "Not because of age," he continued, eyes on the envelope, "but because I've begun to hear the voice of this house." Isabel tilted her head. "Sebastian, if this is—" Silence, he interrupted, not loudly but with finality. For the first time in years, his words carried the weight his late father once had. He placed his hand on the envelope. Inside is the roadmap someone drew to strip everything bearing the Whitford name. Not overnight. Through 12 transfers, 3 forged contracts, 2 lawyer meetings disguised as financial health reviews. And not once was I consulted. Durit sneered. I don't know what you're accusing us of, but every transaction was legal. Is that so? Sebastian smiled, a quiet smile, colder than contempt. Then let me ask again, if I never authorized anything, if the signatures were forged, does it still count as legal? Adrian lowered his gaze. Isabel remained composed. Sebastian, you agreed to everything. You just don't remember, these matters were too technical. I did it to keep Montfleur from going bankrupt. Montfleur isn't bankrupt, he replied. It's been bled dry. Quietly. Bloodlessly. Just smiles and perfume. For the first time, Isabel frowned. Something flickered in her eyes, not guilt, but the shock of being discovered too soon. Sebastian stood. I once believed I was simply aging, outdated, and needed you to handle everything. But then one day, someone saw what I didn't dare to see. Not you. Elena Marceau. The housemaid's daughter. The one you never even noticed. The air shifted at the sound of that name. Isabel glanced toward the door. What did she say? Sebastian looked up. She didn't have to say anything. She recorded it. Every step you took. Every passage you thought invisible. Even the secret room behind the safe. Silence hit the table like a gavel. Adrian looked up. The room. Behind the south hallway. Not on any blueprint. Inside were forged contracts, fake passports, undeclared trusts. Durit turned pale. I had no part in it. Sebastian shook his head. I don't care. I only need you to sign this declaration, your immediate withdrawal from all Whitford estate matters. He slid the document across the table to Durit. As for you, he turned to Isabel. You won't face the press. I'm giving you a choice, sign away your legal representation, withdraw from the accounts, and leave Montfleur. Quietly. Without scandal. Just disappear. Isabel looked at him. Her eyes no longer held steel. Not even anger. Only calculation. As if weighing her odds until, finally, she realized the game was over. I have one condition, she said softly. Don't erase my name from the charity fund. I don't need your name, he replied. Montfleur never did. It only ever needed the truth. Then she signed. Durit signed. Adrian witnessed. No one summoned Elena. But as Sebastian exited the library, his gaze found the hallway. And she was there standing still behind the wall near the bookcase, not hiding but not revealing herself either. He looked at her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. Not a thank you. A nod from someone newly awakened after years of sleep, realizing the one who watched over his slumber wasn't one of his people but the invisible girl everyone had passed by. Elena nodded back, lightly but clearly. And in that ancient house, the old clocks kept ticking. But today, their tick-tocks were no longer reminders of loss. They were the echo of justice. Montfleur was eerily quiet in the days following the confrontation. Not the stifling silence of old when everything suffocated beneath velvet drapes and vintage wine, but a kind of stillness that marked a beginning. Like the hush after a storm when one realizes the walls still stand and the roof, though cracked, still offers shelter. Isabel Whitford left 3 days after the meeting. No warning, no farewells, no one summoned to pack her things. She left everything jewelry, gowns, except for a handwritten letter placed on the ebony dressing table. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. Just a brief note written neatly, pristine as everything she had ever done. No one builds a legacy on love. Only control preserves power. If you trust a maid over the woman who's lived with you for 20 years, then I have no reason to stay. IW. Sebastian read the letter in silence. Then he folded it, not to tear, not to burn, but to place it in the last drawer of his father's desk. Not because he regretted anything, but because, sometimes, deceit deserves a place to be buried. Elena didn't witness Isabel's departure. She was in the laundry room unpinning tablecloths from the drying line, eyes following the slow dance of sunlight through the dusty glass. She didn't ask Sebastian any questions nor waited for anyone to say anything final. She knew her task was done. But truth doesn't disappear just because its job is finished. On Friday morning, Sebastian appeared at the attic room door. Elena was brushing her hair. He knocked gently, a courtesy he had never extended to staff before. She opened the door unsurprised. What do you need, my lord? Sebastian looked around the room. Small, orderly, not much different from a storage room in the basement except for the notebooks neatly lined up on the shelf. One of them lay open on the table. You still keep records? Just a habit, she replied. A way to remember what others overlook. He nodded and stepped inside, but didn't sit. He held out an envelope. The new manager of the Montfleur Foundation needs an independent aide. Someone outside law and finance. I gave them your name. If you're interested, there's an office. And a nameplate. Elena accepted the envelope without opening it. Is this a reward? She asked, eyes never leaving his. Recognition, he answered without hesitation. And an apology for not listening sooner. Elena studied him a moment, then opened the envelope. Inside was an identification card with her name clearly printed. Elena Marceau, Representant Observatrice, Fondation Montfleur. Not an employee. Not a servant. Not the housekeeper's daughter. An observer. Independent. Official. You think I'll stay impartial? You did the right thing without any title. I trust you'll do even better with one. Elena smiled faintly. Not a victorious smile, just one that knew everything had unfolded as it should. She placed the badge on the table beside her oldest notebook. And the room behind the safe, she asked. What do you plan to do with it? Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Seal it, but not destroy it. One day, someone may need to remember the paths once hidden and those brave enough to walk them. Elena nodded. As Sebastian left, she stood watching him, her fingers brushing the nameplate. Then she opened the drawer and took out her mother's old fountain pen, the one reserved for what must not be forgotten. She wrote a new line in her notebook. The only thing more dangerous than lies is the habit of never looking back. That afternoon, Montfleur opened its doors to the early summer sun. The windows were no longer locked. The iron gate had been repainted. The walls had stopped whispering. And at the heart of the old house, the ancient clocks ticked on, not reminders of lost time, but affirmations that everything was beginning again. Chapter 9, The Whisper of Stone. Just weeks after Isabelle left, people said Montfleur had shed its skin. The parlors were stripped of portraits, replaced with old maps and annotations on the estate's history. Lavish wine parties disappeared, making way for private meetings of the Montfleur Foundation. No more theatrical handshakes, just red-marked discussions and crossed-out agendas. Among all the changes, there was one thing no one noticed except Elena Marceau. The hidden room behind the technical wall hadn't been sealed. Sebastian had said he would close it. But he hadn't. Maybe he was too busy. Maybe he wasn't sure. Maybe Elena thought he wanted it to remain as a reminder. But that room wasn't just a warning of past mistakes. It still held something unspoken. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, as mist began to settle over the garden and lavender leaves shimmered with droplets, Elena returned to the technical room. This time, not out of suspicion. Not to eavesdrop. Just to see whether the past had truly come to rest. The old oak door creaked softly. Inside, dust coated the table. The computer had been unplugged. The files were gone. But Elena noticed what she had missed before, a raised floor tile in the corner of the room. She knelt down and placed her hand on the stone. Cold. Rough. When she pressed at the edge, it shifted. A hollow beneath. Using the tip of a key, she pried it up. The tile lifted, revealing a small wooden box wrapped in dark velvet. No label. No lock. Elena didn't open it right away. She looked around. No cameras. No one knew she was there. She lifted the box, placed it on the table, and opened the lid. Inside was a worn leather notebook, its spine frayed, the kind used not for taking notes, but for remembering. On the first page, in slanted, old-fashioned script, black ink read. Carnet d'Isabelle à ouvrir Sije Perdstaut. Isabelle's notebook, open if I lose everything. Elena sat down. Her fingers brushed each page. Not a diary. No confessions, no nostalgia. It was a detailed financial map of the entire Whitford estate from 1989 to the present. Transactions, offshore funds, verbal agreements never formalized, names of intermediaries, even ones never appearing in the official files. She flipped to the last page. A thin slip of paper fell out, blue ink, hastily written. If you find this notebook, it means I made a mistake. But you won't go public. You fear destroying your father's legacy more than losing it. And the girl, if she's the one who finds it, give her this message. I'm not afraid of being exposed. I only regret not having enough time to finish. No signature. But Elena knew the voice. Isabelle. She sat there for a long time. Fingers resting on the notebook, eyes on that final page. What she felt wasn't anger or vindication. It was a strange sorrow, the kind that comes only when you realize every ugly thing had its reason but no justification. Elena slipped the notebook into her coat pocket. She didn't think twice. Didn't photograph it. Didn't copy it. As she left the room, she paused at the doorway. Behind her, the tile was back in place. The room was silent. She locked the entrance. And this time not with a bolt, but with words. She taped a small note above the brick ledge. Enough. No need to return. That night, Sebastian received a small parcel with no return name. Inside was the leather notebook. No explanation. No letter. He read it in the library. Alone. The lights stayed on until late. The next morning, he walked to the garden where Elena was checking the herb inventory for the Foundation's upcoming education program. "Did you keep a copy?" he asked. Elena didn't look up. "No." "Why not?" She set her notebook down and wiped her hands. "Because I don't need to. You keep it to remember." "I keep the memory of how it was found." Sebastian was silent. He nodded. Then, just before turning away, he added, his voice softer than a master's and more honest than a man repaying a debt. "You don't have to stay." Elena smiled. "I know. But it's not time to leave yet." That summer came late. The warm sunlight did not blaze as it had in previous years, but quietly bathed the valley in a soft glow as if the skies themselves understood that Montfleur had just weathered an unnamed storm. In the southern garden, for the first time in nearly a decade, asters were planted again, the flower Sebastian's mother had once loved, which had vanished along with her after her sudden death. The plot of land that Isabel had once converted into a stone terrace was now restored on Elena's proposal during a Montfleur Foundation meeting. No one objected. No one called it heritage renovation. It was simply a rightful return of what should be remembered. Since Isabel's departure, Elena's role no longer involved setting tables or preparing tea. She now attended formal meetings, reviewed grant proposals, challenged investment reports, and still wrote in her notebooks. But the pages no longer chronicled schemes and shadows. They laid out plans for what needed to be sown. One early morning, Elena was summoned to Sebastian's office. The room had changed little, same old bookcases, dark wood-paneled walls, the leather chair with its slightly reclined back, but the light was different. No longer the gloom of past years, but the light of an open window, drapes tied back, as though the room itself had just woken up. Sebastian was writing, a rare sight. Before him was a draft for the Montfleur Renewal Program, a new initiative to transform the chateau into not only a family legacy but a center for teaching cultural and estate management to local youth. "You once said," he looked up, "that Montfleur should be returned to its rightful keepers. I think it's time to pass it on." Elena raised an eyebrow. Not surprised. But Sebastian rarely spoke so plainly. "You intend to leave the chateau?" she asked. Sebastian shook his head. "No. But I no longer want it to belong to one bloodline. If anything is worth preserving, it's how Montfleur has survived through the hands of those never named in its history." He slid a folder toward her. "I want you to coordinate the program. Build the foundation. Recruit. Shape the content." Elena looked at the pages. Her name was already printed on the cover, responsible de mission, revalorization Montfleur. "What will people say when they learn I used to be a maid?" she asked, half mocking, half serious. "They'll say," Sebastian replied, "that for once, someone who saw the truth was trusted enough to build something new." She said nothing more. Just nodded, slowly, steadily, just as she had the first time he asked if she would stay. On the program's opening day, Elena opened the north gate, the one previously reserved for VIP guests, to welcome a group of final-year students studying cultural heritage management. They were surprised to be greeted not by an elderly butler or a tweed-clad historian, but a young woman in a white shirt, calm voice, steady eyes. "Welcome to Montfleur," she said. "Not to admire, but to understand how it works and to learn how to preserve what no book ever teaches." The students followed her through the gate, where the grass had been trimmed but a few wild lavender bushes had been left. Elena didn't want this place to become a museum. She wanted it to keep breathing. That night, she stayed later than usual. As she passed through the southern corridor, once haunted by mysterious clicks, once hiding a room behind a wall, she paused. No more strange sounds. No mechanisms. No trace of hidden passageways. But where the ancestral portrait once hung, now stood a large mirror. When she looked into it, Elena saw herself clearly, fully, no longer a blur in someone else's frame. She touched the mirror. A deep voice spoke behind her, "It's changed." She turned. It was Sebastian, holding a notebook. He didn't smile, but his eyes were gentler. "You know," he said, "my father once told me when you stop doubting your own home, that's when you begin to lose it." Elena replied. "And sometimes the best keepers are the ones who were once left outside." They said no more. They turned together toward the hallway, walking slowly. Inside the chateau, the old clock began to chime, not just marking time, but marking a new rhythm. A new season. A future with nothing left to hide. In a newly renovated office on the east side of the chateau, once a wartime wine cellar, Elena organized the documents for the Montfleur revalorization program. Natural light from the French windows streamed across her desk, casting pale golden strips like honey wax. The room smelled of new wood, paper, and the dried lavender bunch she had hung near the window, a scent she brought down from the old attic room, a reminder of where she had once stood. That afternoon, she wrote her first internal report to the foundation board. In the introduction, she penned, "Montler used to be a symbol of silence. Now it has become a place to listen." The report went beyond progress updates. She wove in reflections on heritage, not just stone walls, but the way stories are preserved, told truthfully, and not distorted by power or lineage. She submitted the report just as the chapel bells behind the chateau rang for the evening. Elena stood and stepped onto the balcony overlooking the southern garden. Among the new flower beds, she saw the students digging, taking notes, laughing. One of them, a curly-haired boy named Luke, looked up and waved. Elena waved back, her gaze calm. She wasn't used to being so clearly seen. She had lived most of her life in the shadows, behind curtains, behind half-closed doors, behind the wary glances of those who saw her only as part of the backdrop. Yet it was exactly that position that had allowed her to observe the whole picture. That evening, Sebastian invited her to dinner in the small dining room behind the kitchen, once meant for staff, later abandoned. They sat across from each other. No servants, no fine wine, just a simple soup and warm bread. Just like the way Montfleur was being reborn. No grand spectacle, only the right people at the right time. After the meal, he handed her an envelope. "This was left by my father. I found it in the old safe behind the library. Sealed. On the outside it says, to be given to the first person who saves Montfleur without bearing the Whitford name." Elena froze. Looked at him. "You're not joking?" Sebastian gave a small smile. "If I were good at jokes, Isabel might have stayed." She took the letter, opening it slowly. Inside was a thin, cream-colored page, handwritten in a firm, clear script, not Sebastian's. "If you are reading this, the house has awakened from its slumber. The one who wrote this was the one who once let it sleep. If you are a person of light, let Montfleur no longer be a shadow, but a shade for those who need a place to begin." No signature. Just a final period and a faint smudge of ink, perhaps from a trembling hand or from tears. No one would know. Elena folded the letter, set it on the table, her fingers lingering as if trying to hold on to a feeling too delicate to name. When she returned to her room, night had fully fallen. The stone corridors of Montfleur remained quiet but no longer overwhelming. Her footsteps no longer disappeared into thick walls but echoed clear, steady, confident. At her desk, she placed the letter in a small glass frame. Then she wrote one final line in her notebook for the day. "There are legacies built with stone. There are legacies kept through memory. But only those reborn through courage survive the generations." Elena closed her notebook. Outside, the clock rang once again, this time no longer a lonely echo but a steady stride in harmony with the new life beating in every stone of Montfleur. One autumn morning, a thin veil of mist covered the sky like the lace veil of a fairy tale bride. From the foot of the hill, villagers from Saint-Eliot began making their way to Montfleur. They brought no wine, no flowers, only curiosity, a trace of skepticism, and a quiet eagerness for a place they had admired from afar for decades. At the wide iron gate, a brand-new brass plaque gleamed above the arch, Montfleur, no longer a legend. A part of the present. Elena stood on the marble steps wearing no ball gown, no crown, just a simple brown coat and a quiet smile. Beside her was Sebastian, for the first time without a suit jacket, sleeves casually rolled up, his eyes glistening as he watched the crowd approach. There was no ceremony. They simply left the doors open. By noon, sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the old chapel, scattering light across the floor like shards of glass pieced together. People viewed the paintings, admired the architecture, ran their hands over the stone walls as if to test their reality. Children ran through the gardens that had once been forbidden. The elderly sat under trees, gazing up at bell towers they had never imagined stepping inside. Elena led a group of schoolchildren through the southern hallway, telling them stories of the secret passage behind the library, of the scrolls hidden within the walls, of a safe that didn't hold money but evidence, and of a woman who had nearly erased an entire legacy with a gentle laugh. The children stared wide-eyed, not fully understanding, but sensing clearly that this place had once been the stage for a play no one had watched from beginning to end. In the afternoon, just before nightfall, a young woman named Margot, a restoration student from Paris, handed Elena a painting newly cleaned and restored. An old portrait. A woman in a white dress standing in Montfleur's garden, her smile ambiguous, her eyes looking toward a place no one could name. Elena was silent for a moment. "Is it her?" Margot asked softly. Elena nodded. Vivian. She once wanted to make this place hers alone. Will you display it? Elena thought for a moment, then replied, yes, but not in the grand hall. In the archives, so that anyone seeking it can find it, not to glorify but to remember. As night fell, people gradually left the chateau. The gates of Montfleur remained ajar. Elena and Sebastian stood in the twilight, looking toward the village, where golden lights flickered like stars fallen to earth. Do you think people will believe what we've done? She asked. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, then answered, not everyone will, but those who need to believe they came, and they'll return. She turned to him, her gaze steady. I think your father would be proud. Perhaps, but I know for certain. If he were still alive, he would have said something else. What? Thank you for seeing what I could not. That night, Elena returned to her small room, once a guest room. On the door was still the brass plaque with her name, Elena Morrison. No title, no role. Just a name like so many who had come through this place, but this time one not forgotten. She sat at her desk and opened the old notebook, now filled cover to cover. But instead of writing more, she closed it, placed it in a wooden box, and set it on the top shelf. A chapter had closed. She took out a new notebook, black cover, crisp pages still scented with fresh ink, and wrote the first line. The day Montfleur opened its doors, not to reveal the past, but to let people see themselves in the present. She smiled and shut the notebook. Outside, the chateau's clock chimed 9 times, a sound that rang not as a solemn echo of truth once hidden, but as a confirmation. Montfleur was no longer a place that concealed the truth. It had become a place that shared it.